Rain poured heavily that night, washing the streets and filling the corners with water. The city was silent, except for the sound of water hitting the rooftops and cars parked along the road. In that quiet, almost forgotten street, a man named Daniel sat inside his small apartment. He was reading an old book, the only company he often had. Daniel was a man of habit, someone who kept to himself, someone who lived with a calm face but a heart that carried hidden loneliness. His life was simple. He worked during the day at a small office and returned home in the evening to an empty space. His walls were decorated with nothing more than books and a few pictures from his younger days. He had friends once, but time and distance had pulled them away. He had family, but they lived far and calls had become rare. He had once hoped for love, but his heart had learned to stay quiet after facing disappointment. That night, as Daniel turned another page of his book, there was a sudden knock at the door. At first, he thought he had imagined it. The rain was so strong that it could easily sound like knocking. But then it came again, louder this time, urgent, desperate, not the kind of knock that could be ignored. He frowned and stood up, wondering who could be outside at this hour. When he opened the door, the sight before him froze him in place. A young woman stood there, drenched from head to toe, her hair sticking to her face, her clothes soaked from the rain. Her eyes were swollen, not just from the water but from tears. She looked both frightened and exhausted, as if life itself had been too heavy for her to carry. Her lips trembled, and before Daniel could even ask who she was, she cried out in a broken voice, "Please let me in. I'll give birth to your child, just don't leave me outside." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The words struck him like lightning, not just because of what she said, but because he recognized her face. It was Amina, a name he hadn't spoken for years, a memory he had tried to bury but never truly forgotten. They had known each other once, more than known. They had shared dreams in their younger years. But those dreams had been stolen away when her life was forced down another path. He stared at her, stunned, his hand still holding the door. The rain behind her was relentless, as if the world itself wanted to push her into his home. She clutched her arms around herself, shivering, waiting for him to answer, waiting to see if he would close the door or let her inside. Daniel's voice trembled slightly when he finally spoke. "Amina, what are you doing here?" Her eyes filled with more tears at the sound of her name. She took a step closer, her hands pressed together as if she was praying. "I had nowhere else to go," she whispered. "Please, Daniel, I can't be out here tonight. Just let me in." For a moment his mind was torn. Part of him wanted to ask questions. Why now? Why come here? Why say those words? Another part of him remembered the girl he once loved, the one who had been taken away from him by decisions that weren't hers. That part of him couldn't bear to see her like this, fragile, broken, yet still holding on with all the courage she had left. Without another word, Daniel stepped aside and opened the door wider. Amina rushed inside, dripping water onto the floor. She leaned against the wall, breathing heavily as if the simple act of being let in had taken a weight off her chest. Daniel closed the door, shutting out the storm, and turned to face her. Her clothes clung to her like a second skin, her face pale from the cold. He quickly went to his small cupboard and pulled out a towel. Handing it to her, he said softly, "Here, dry yourself. You'll catch a fever like this." She took it with shaky hands, her eyes never leaving his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was filled only with the sound of rain against the window and the quiet beating of two hearts that hadn't been this close in years. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "What did you mean when you said those words at the door?" Amina lowered her gaze, clutching the towel tightly. Her lips quivered as she tried to explain. "I didn't know how else to make you open. I needed you to let me in. I've lost so much, Daniel. I didn't want to lose the chance to be safe tonight." Her honesty pierced through him. She was not speaking out of games or manipulation. She was speaking from pain, from desperation. Daniel's eyes softened and he pulled out a chair for her. "Sit down," he said gently. "You're safe here. No one will hurt you." Amina sat slowly, her body trembling less now, but her heart still heavy. She looked around his apartment, noticing how plain it was, how quiet. It was a reflection of him, steady but lonely. She looked back at him and whispered, "Do you hate me, Daniel?" The question caught him off guard. Hate her? He had never hated her. He had hated the way life had taken her away, hated the way he had been powerless to stop it. But her? No, he could never hate her. He shook his head slowly. "No, Amina, I could never hate you. Her eyes filled again and tears rolled down her cheeks. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. Daniel stood there, unsure if he should comfort her or give her space. But his heart wouldn't let him just watch. He walked closer, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said softly. "You're here now. That's what matters." She lowered her hands and looked up at him, her eyes red but filled with something fragile, hope. For the first time that night she managed a small smile, though it trembled at the edges. Daniel felt something stir inside him, something he thought had died long ago. The night stretched on, but the storm outside no longer mattered. Inside that small apartment, two hearts that had once been separated by fate found themselves standing face to face again. The story of why she had come, of what she had lost, and of what might happen next would unfold slowly. But in that first moment, what mattered most was simple. She was no longer alone in the rain, and he was no longer alone in his silence. And though Daniel didn't say it out loud, a quiet thought crossed his mind as he watched her. Maybe, just maybe, this night was not the end of something, but the beginning of everything. The morning came slowly, with the sun struggling to break through the thick clouds. Daniel had not slept much that night. He sat in his chair, watching Amina as she slept on the couch wrapped in a blanket he had given her. Her breathing was soft, her face calmer than it had been the night before. The storm had ended, but he knew another kind of storm lived inside her heart. When she finally opened her eyes, it was as if she had woken from a heavy dream. For a moment she looked around, unsure of where she was, until her gaze met his. Daniel gave her a small, gentle smile. "You're safe," he said quietly. "You fell asleep here." She pushed herself up slowly, embarrassed but grateful. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't," Daniel replied. "I'm glad you came." The words surprised her. She hadn't expected kindness, not after all the years that had passed. She had expected questions, maybe even rejection, but not this quiet warmth. Her hands shook slightly as she held the blanket around her shoulders and her eyes lowered. Daniel walked to the small kitchen and poured 2 cups of tea. He set one in front of her and sat across the table. The steam rose between them, and with it came silence. Neither knew where to begin. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Why now, Amina? After all these years, why come here?" She held the cup with both hands, staring into the warm liquid as if it could give her strength. "Because you were the only person I could think of," she said softly. "The only one I ever trusted." Her words cut through him like a knife, but not from pain, more from the weight they carried. He remembered the girl she had been, full of laughter and light, and the way they had once dreamed of building a life together. But her family had decided otherwise. She had been married off to another man, and Daniel had been left behind with nothing but memories. "What happened, Amina?" he asked carefully. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time she did not try to hide them. "I tried to make it work," she whispered. "I tried to be the wife everyone wanted me to be. But it was never love, Daniel. It was a prison. And when I needed care the most, I was abandoned. Left alone. Left with a child I had no way to protect." Daniel's heart tightened at her words. He leaned forward, his voice steady. "You're not alone now." Her tears fell freely, rolling down her cheeks. She placed the cup on the table with shaking hands. "I lost everything," she said. "My family turned away from me because I left. The people who promised to stand by me disappeared when I needed them. I had nowhere to go. And last night, standing in the rain, all I could think of was you. The boy who once promised me I would never cry alone. I didn't know if you would open the door, but I prayed you would." Daniel felt something stir deep inside him, something he thought time had buried. The memory of his own promise came back to him, words he had spoken when they were young. "You'll never cry alone as long as I'm here." He had said it once, and life had stolen the chance to keep it. But here she was again, in front of him, asking for the same safety. He reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. She looked up, startled by the touch, but she did not pull away. "I can't change the past," he said softly. "But I can promise you this now. You won't face the future alone." The warmth of his words broke her even more, but in a way that brought relief. She sobbed quietly, not out of fear, but because for the first time in years she felt she was being seen and heard. That day, Daniel showed her simple kindness. He cooked a small meal, shared his home, and treated her not as a burden, but as someone who belonged. They spoke little, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was filled with unspoken understanding. In the evening, as the sky grew darker again, Amina sat by the window. She looked outside, watching the street where the storm had been so cruel the night before. Daniel joined her, standing quietly by her side. "You must think I'm weak," she said suddenly. He shook his head firmly. "No, you're stronger than anyone I know. It takes strength to walk away from what breaks you. It takes even more to knock on a door not knowing if it will open." She turned to him, her eyes wide. "And if you hadn't opened it?" Daniel sighed, his voice heavy with truth. "Then I would have lived with the regret for the rest of my life." The honesty of his words left her speechless. For years she had believed that chapter of her life was closed, that Daniel was only a memory she was forbidden to touch. Yet here he was, standing before her, his eyes carrying the same quiet kindness she had once fallen in love with. Amina pressed her hands together, trembling. "I don't want to be a burden to you," she said. "I just need time. Time to breathe. Time to feel human again." "You're not a burden," Daniel replied. "Stay as long as you need." She looked at him with disbelief, as though she hadn't expected such generosity. In her life, people had always demanded something in return, always put conditions on kindness. But Daniel was different. He asked for nothing, offered everything, and expected only honesty. That night, as they prepared to rest, Amina whispered something that Daniel would remember for a long time. "When I stood outside your door, I thought I had lost every piece of myself. But sitting here now, I feel like I've found a part of me I thought was gone forever." Daniel said nothing in return, but inside, he felt the same. The part of him that had been silent for years, the part that had given up on love and family, was slowly beginning to wake. And as he watched her fall asleep again, he knew that her return was not an accident. Life had brought her back for a reason. The road ahead would not be easy. He could see the pain she carried, the weight of her past, but he also saw something else, the possibility of a future neither of them had dared to dream of again. He whispered into the quiet room, words meant only for himself but carried by the night. "You're home now, Amina. You're home." The rain had gone, the night was calm, and inside that small apartment, two souls who had once been separated by fate found themselves beginning to heal together. The days passed slowly, yet each one seemed to carry something new for both Daniel and Amina. What had begun as a desperate knock at the door was now turning into a fragile routine. Daniel found himself waking earlier, making breakfast for two instead of one, and arranging his time so that he could spend more moments at home. It felt strange at first, but not unpleasant. Amina, still recovering from the storm of her past, moved gently through the apartment. She was quiet most of the time, but in her silence there was a kind of grace. She folded the blanket neatly each morning, washed the dishes after meals, and often sat by the window with her thoughts. Daniel would watch her sometimes, not with pity but with curiosity, as if trying to understand what was happening inside her heart. One afternoon, while Daniel was preparing tea, he noticed her staring at a small photo on the shelf. It was an old picture of him in his younger years, smiling with friends at a park. She picked it up carefully, brushing her fingers across the frame. "You still have this smile," she said softly. Daniel paused, a little surprised. "Do I?" he asked, pouring water into the cups. She turned toward him, her eyes studying his face. "It's quieter now, maybe hidden, but it's still there." Her words made him realize how much she still saw him, even after all the time apart. For years he had felt invisible, unnoticed in the routine of his life. But Amina's presence was slowly reminding him that he was more than a man of silence. He was someone who had once laughed, once loved, and maybe could again. At first, he hesitated to let her into his world completely. His heart had been bruised before, and he feared what might happen if he opened it too much. But as days turned into weeks, the walls he had built began to soften. He found himself listening more closely when she spoke, asking her questions about her thoughts and sharing little stories from his own days at work. Amina, in return, began to open up. She told him about the years after they had parted. Her voice often trembled, but Daniel listened with patience, never judging. She spoke of the struggles of being forced into a life she had not chosen, the loneliness she carried even when surrounded by people, and the way her heart had broken piece by piece. I thought I would never feel safe again, she admitted one evening, her hands folded tightly on her lap. But when you opened that door, it was like a part of me woke up. I don't know if I can ever give you what you deserve, but I want you to know I am grateful. Daniel looked at her for a long moment before answering. You don't need to give me anything. Just being here, being honest, that's enough. Her eyes glistened with tears, but this time they were softer, less heavy. There was hope in them, a light beginning to return. Slowly, laughter began to find its way back into their lives. It started with small things, a funny comment about his cooking, the way she teased him when he mispronounced a word while reading, or the times he clumsily tried to fix something around the house and failed. Their laughter filled the apartment in a way it hadn't been filled in years. One evening, as they were washing dishes together, Amina splashed a little water at him by accident. Daniel looked at her in mock surprise, then deliberately flicked water back at her. She gasped and laughed, trying to scold him, but her smile gave her away. They ended up laughing so hard that the dishes almost slipped from their hands. It was a simple moment, yet it felt like a gift. But behind the smiles, Daniel could still see the shadows in her eyes. He knew she carried fears that couldn't vanish overnight. Sometimes, late at night, he would hear her shift restlessly on the couch, whispering in her sleep. He didn't wake her, but he stayed close, making sure she wasn't alone in the darkness. One night, unable to hold back, she finally confessed. I'm scared, she whispered into the quiet room. Daniel looked at her, waiting for her to continue. I'm scared of being abandoned again. I'm scared of building something only to lose it. I don't know if I can trust the future. Her voice cracked and she covered her face with her hands. Daniel's heart ached, but he spoke with a calm strength. I can't promise you that life will never hurt us again, but I can promise you that as long as I'm here, you won't face it alone. I won't run away from you, Amina. Her hands fell from her face and she looked at him with eyes wide open. No one had ever said those words to her. No one had offered not perfection, but presence. She reached out slowly, taking his hand in hers, and whispered, That's all I ever wanted. From that night on, something changed. Their bond grew deeper, not just out of shared memories, but out of new trust being built. Amina began helping Daniel with small things around the home, cooking meals together, folding his clothes, and even organizing the bookshelf that had been untouched for years. Daniel, in turn, found himself looking forward to coming home each day, eager to see her smile, eager to feel the warmth she brought. The neighbors noticed the change, too. Once, Daniel had been seen as the quiet man who lived alone and spoke little. Now there was laughter coming from his window, and the sight of a woman by his side when they walked together. People whispered, curious, but Daniel didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he felt alive. One Sunday, Daniel took her to the small park near his home. The trees were full of green and the air smelled fresh after rain. They sat on a bench watching children play nearby. Amina's eyes softened as she watched them run and laugh. She placed a hand gently over her stomach and whispered, I want my child to grow up with this kind of joy. Daniel looked at her, the weight of her words settling deeply in his heart. He nodded slowly. And they will. I'll make sure of it. Amina turned to him, her eyes wide. Do you mean that? Yes, he said simply. I want to be part of this with you. Her lips trembled as she tried to hold back tears. She didn't answer right away, but the way she leaned closer, resting her head lightly on his shoulder, spoke louder than words. That evening, as they walked back home together, Daniel realized that his life had changed completely in just a matter of weeks. The loneliness that had once been his closest companion was gone, replaced by something new, hope, love, and the promise of a shared tomorrow. Inside the apartment, the silence that once felt heavy now felt comforting. They sat together, talking about little things, the food they liked, the places they once dreamed of visiting, the silly mistakes they had made as children. Each story connected them more deeply, weaving threads of trust that no storm could easily break. As the night grew darker, Amina whispered one more time, her voice soft but filled with truth. Thank you for letting me stay. Thank you for giving me a chance to breathe again. Daniel reached for her hand, holding it firmly but gently. You don't need to thank me. This is where you belong. Her eyes filled with quiet joy, and for the first time in many years she believed those words. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm into Daniel's life that he had never imagined possible. His once silent apartment now felt alive with warmth. Amina had brought with her not just her presence but a sense of purpose that Daniel had quietly longed for, without even realizing it. She filled the spaces with small touches, arranging flowers in an old vase, folding his shirts neatly in a way he never did, cooking meals that carried a taste of comfort he hadn't known in years. Daniel found himself waking up earlier than usual, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He wanted to make sure she had everything she needed, to check on her, to hear her voice in the morning. It was strange for him, a man who had been used to living alone for so long, to suddenly feel the joy of companionship. But instead of resisting it, he welcomed it. One evening, as they sat together on the small balcony of his apartment, Amina leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The air was cool and the stars peeked faintly through the clouds. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what life might have been like if things had gone differently?" Daniel turned to look at her, his heart tightening at the question. "All the time," he admitted. "I used to imagine it every day, but then I stopped because it hurt too much." She opened her eyes and studied him quietly. "I imagined it too," she whispered. "And sometimes I still do." Their eyes met, and for a long moment nothing needed to be said. They both knew that the past was filled with pain, but the present was giving them something they had once thought impossible: a second chance. As the days continued, Daniel noticed how much Amina was changing too. When she first arrived, she had been broken, fragile, and filled with fear. But slowly, under the safety of his roof and his care, her strength began to show again. She laughed more, her eyes shone brighter, and her voice carried confidence. Still, there were moments when her fears returned. Some nights she would sit awake, staring out of the window, lost in thought. Daniel often joined her in silence, respecting her space, but always making sure she knew he was near. One night, unable to hold back, she said quietly, "I don't know if I deserve this. This peace, this kindness. I've made mistakes." Daniel shook his head gently. "Amina, everyone has made mistakes, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve happiness. You've carried so much pain alone. Let me share it with you now." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she was worthy of being cared for. One morning they went for a walk in the park again. The trees swayed gently and children played nearby. Amina stopped for a moment, watching them with a faraway look. Daniel noticed her hand resting protectively on her stomach, and he felt a wave of emotions wash over him. Without thinking, he placed his hand gently over hers. She looked up at him in surprise, but his eyes told her everything he couldn't put into words. "I want to be here," he said quietly. "Through everything. I want to be part of this with you." Her lips trembled as she tried to respond, but instead of words, tears filled her eyes. She nodded slowly, leaning into him. For her, it was not just his words, but the way he said them, with sincerity, with no hesitation, that made her heart believe. From that day, Daniel became even more involved in her journey. He accompanied her to the clinic, sitting beside her as the doctor explained the progress of her pregnancy. He listened carefully, asking questions when she couldn't, making sure everything was in order. Amina often looked at him during those moments and felt her heart ache, not with pain but with gratitude. She had never expected anyone to stand by her like this, to take responsibility for her well-being with so much care. At home, Daniel began cooking meals that the doctor recommended, laughing at himself when he got recipes wrong. "It's too salty," he admitted one evening, making her giggle as she tried to eat his attempt at soup. She shook her head playfully. "It's not perfect, but it's made with love. That makes it better than anything else." Their days grew brighter with such small joys. They talked about simple things like the names of flowers in the park or the books Daniel had collected. They even argued lightly sometimes about silly things like how to arrange the kitchen shelves, but even those arguments ended in laughter, reminding them both of the sweetness of ordinary life. One evening, as the rain returned outside, Amina sat by the window with Daniel beside her. The sound of raindrops was steady, almost like music. She turned to him and whispered, "I want this to last. I don't want to lose it again." Daniel took her hand gently, holding it as though it were the most precious thing in the world. "Then stay," he said simply. "Stay with me. We don't have to think about tomorrow. Just stay." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief, of joy. She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, and whispered, "I will." That night, something shifted. The bond they had was no longer just about comfort or protection. It was about love. Love that had been buried by time and pain, now finding its way back to life. Daniel realized that his once quiet apartment had become a home. Not because of the walls or the furniture, but because of her presence. And Amina realized that the safety she had prayed for was finally hers. Not because she was hiding from the world, but because someone was standing beside her, holding her hand through it all. As days turned into nights and weeks stretched on, the two of them built a world inside that small space. They cooked together, laughed together, and dreamed together. And though challenges still waited outside those doors, inside they found peace. One morning, as they sat with their tea, Daniel looked at her with a steady gaze. "You said you came here because you had nowhere else to go. But I want you to know something. You don't have to go anywhere else ever again. This is your home now, as long as you want it to be." Her hand shook slightly as she held her cup, and her voice trembled when she answered, "I want it, Daniel. More than anything, I want to stay with you." He smiled, and in that moment both of them knew that the promise of new beginnings had already taken root. What once felt like a fragile chance was now growing into something stronger, something unshakable. And as the rain cleared that morning, the light of a new day entered their lives, carrying with it the quiet certainty that love had finally found its way back to them. The day came quietly, without warning, and yet it carried the weight of everything Daniel and Amina had been waiting for. The morning had been calm, filled with the sound of birds outside and the warmth of the sun streaming through the window. Amina had been feeling restless for days, her steps slower, her body carrying the strain of the journey she was on. Daniel had been more attentive than ever, making sure she had water, food, and rest. But that morning, when she suddenly gripped his hand tightly and whispered, "It's time," his heart nearly stopped. He had read about it, prepared as best as he could, but nothing compared to the reality of seeing her face pale with pain, her breath coming fast. Panic rose inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm for her sake. He helped her to the car, his hands trembling as he held her close, whispering again and again, "I'm here. I won't leave you." The drive to the hospital felt endless, every red light and every turn stretching time. Amina clutched his hand throughout. Her eyes closed, her face pressed against the seat as she tried to breathe through the pain. Daniel kept glancing at her, his heart breaking to see her suffer, wishing he could take her pain away. When they arrived, nurses rushed to help, guiding her into the room while Daniel stayed by her side. He refused to step away, refused to let go of her hand. The hours that followed were long, filled with her cries, his whispered encouragement, and the constant rhythm of the hospital machines. He wiped her forehead with a damp cloth, held her hand tighter when she squeezed his, and whispered words of strength when her voice trembled. "You're not alone," he told her again and again. "I'm right here, Amina. I'll never leave you." Her eyes, filled with tears and exhaustion, looked at him with gratitude, as if those words gave her the strength to go on. And then at last the moment arrived. The sound of a baby's cry filled the room, piercing the air with a miracle that neither of them would ever forget. Daniel's eyes filled with tears the moment he heard it. He turned to see the nurse holding the tiny child, wrapping it carefully before placing it into Amina's arms. She was exhausted, her face damp with sweat, but when she looked down at the small life in her arms, her entire being softened. She smiled through her tears, whispering words only a mother could say. Daniel stood frozen, his chest rising and falling with emotions he had never known before. Then the nurse turned to him, gently handing him the baby. His hands trembled as he took the small bundle, holding it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The baby's eyes fluttered open for a brief second, and Daniel felt something inside him break. Every wall, every fear, every piece of loneliness he had ever carried disappeared in that moment. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "This is our child now. Our family." Amina watched him, her own eyes wet with tears. "I told you," she whispered weakly. "I just needed to be let in. And you did." Daniel looked at her, then at the baby in his arms, and he knew his life would never be the same. For years he had lived in silence and emptiness, believing love had passed him by. But here, in this hospital room, he had found everything he thought he had lost. A woman who had once been taken from him, now returned, and a child who would carry their future forward. When they returned home days later, the apartment felt different. It was no longer just his or hers. It was theirs. The walls, once plain and quiet, now echoed with the soft cries of the baby, with the sounds of gentle lullabies, with the quiet laughter of two people who had found love again. Daniel worked harder than ever, not just at his office but at home. He learned how to hold the baby, how to feed it, how to walk around the room late at night when it cried. At first he was clumsy, nervous about every little detail, but Amina's gentle guidance and her patience helped him grow into his role. Soon he found himself smiling whenever the baby curled its tiny hand around his finger, whenever it looked up at him with innocent eyes. One evening, as the baby slept peacefully, Daniel sat on the couch with Amina by his side. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand holding his. The room was filled with a quiet peace, the kind that only comes when love is present. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Letting me in that night?" Daniel turned his head to look at her, his eyes steady and filled with truth. "Never. That night was the beginning of everything. If I hadn't opened the door, I would still be living in silence, and I would have lost the chance to hold you again, to hold our child. No, Amina, I don't regret it. I thank God every day that you knocked." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were not the same tears she had cried when she first arrived. These were tears of joy, of peace, of finally belonging. She whispered, "I don't want to leave. I want to stay with you forever." Daniel kissed her forehead softly, his voice strong as he replied, "Then stay. Stay with me, not just tonight, not just for now. Stay with me forever." Her smile trembled, but her heart believed him. She pressed her face against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and knew she was exactly where she belonged. As the months passed, their lives settled into a rhythm. Daniel went to work each day with a lighter step, knowing he had something waiting for him at home. Amina cared for the baby, filling the house with songs and stories, her laughter slowly returning in full. And every evening when Daniel walked through the door, the sight of Amina and the baby waiting for him erased every worry of the day. Neighbors noticed the change even more. The once quiet man now walked with purpose, pushing a stroller beside a woman whose eyes shone with life. People whispered, but this time their whispers carried admiration, not curiosity. They could see the happiness that had bloomed where once there had been silence. Daniel often thought about the night she knocked on his door. He remembered her broken voice, her trembling body, her desperate plea, and then he would look at her now, smiling with their child in her arms, and realize that night had been fate, a knock that changed everything. One night, as they stood together by the window, the baby sleeping peacefully in the other room, Daniel wrapped his arm around Amina and whispered, "I used to think my life was over, that nothing new could come. But you proved me wrong. You gave me back my heart." Amina turned to him, her eyes soft with love. "And you gave me back my hope," she replied. The rain began to fall outside, gentle and steady, but this time it wasn't a storm. It was a calm rain, the kind that nourishes the earth, the kind that brings life. They stood together, watching it fall, their hearts at peace. Inside that small apartment, no longer silent, lived a family that had been born from pain but built on love. A family that had found its way back to each other. And as Daniel held Amina close, his voice steady with love, he whispered again, "Stay with me, always."